It's my pleasure to introduce today's program of honorees, advocates for people with hearing loss. The Nederlander organization, Hands On, Ruth Bernstein, and Cecile Nepal. To get a greater appreciation of why these awards are so important, I thought it would be very helpful to give you a 5-minute short course in hearing loss advocacy. This would be a good time to tell you that I'm totally deaf, and I'm hearing through the miracle of bilateral cochlear implants. There's no way for you to know just by looking at me that I have this or how much I'm hearing either. So lesson number 1 is that hearing loss is an invisible disability, and it is often misunderstood, underestimated, and neglected. There are now an estimated 40 million Americans with hearing loss. So let's look at the 3 main forms of access for people with hearing loss. You'll see that we have them here today. The assistive listening systems. We have an induction loop in this room, and I know that some people are using it. There are 2 other types of assistive listening systems, infrared and FM. These systems are for people who benefit from amplification. Then there's captioning. We have real-time captioning here today because it's a live event. There are other kinds of captioning, post-production captioning for TV, videos, and movies, and scripted captioning for live theater. Captioning is useful for people who don't benefit fully or at all from assistive listening systems. This is open captioning, where everyone can see the words without having to ask for the accommodation. And that is considered universal access. That is what should be provided at public events, just like a ramp. We have sign language interpreters today, used by people who are in the signing deaf, capital D, community. There are an estimated 500,000 Americans who use American Sign Language as their main means of communication. So, lesson number 2 is that these 3 types of accommodations, assistive listening systems, captioning, interpreters, are the focus of hearing loss advocacy. These are our ramps. When I first came to the center, then the League for the Hard of Hearing, in the early 1970s, there were no assistive listening systems, no captioning, and no laws mandating access. It didn't exist. Access pretty much meant sign language interpreters, but like most people with hearing loss, I didn't use sign language. By the late 1970s, closed captioning decoders became available for TVs. In 1993, all TV sets were required to have built-in captioning capability. And in 2006, all TV stations were required to provide closed captioning. In 2012, legislation mandated that internet videos that had been televised had to provide captioning. In the 1970s, Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act required disability access for federally funded facilities. Assistive listening systems started making their appearance in the 1980s, particularly in Broadway theaters, and sign language interpreted performances began then as well, by Hands On and the Theater Development Fund. In the early 1990s, the FCC mandated telephone relay services, which now include captioned and video phones and a variety of apps for cell phones as well. In 1991, enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, finally gave us a law that requires effective communication. with specifics about the 3 types of accommodations. Unfortunately, it is a complaint-driven law. So, lesson number 3 is that even though we have important legislation addressing access for people with hearing loss, the laws are often ignored. And since captioning and assistive listening systems are relatively new, there is also astonishing ignorance among providers as well as people with hearing loss about what is available and required. You can now see why advocacy for people with hearing loss became a serious mission with the signing of the ADA in 1991. That is when the CHC, then the League for the Hard of Hearing, formed Advocates for Better Communication, ABC, to educate facilities and consumers on their rights and legal obligations. Now think about all the places that spoken language needs to be understood. TV, movies, conferences, classrooms, theaters, museums, public events, hospitals, the workplace, every facet of life. And you can see how huge communication access is. Let's look at one example. Theater captioning, something I know something about. Imagine that you couldn't go to the theater because you needed captioning and no shows provided it. Imagine walking around Times Square at 10:30 at night, watching people scurrying around with playbills in hand. Imagine thinking theater is only for other people, not for me. That was my reality and many others like me. That changed with successful advocacy of open caption live theater in 1996 at the Paper Mill Playhouse in New Jersey, and then brought to Broadway by the Theater Development Fund in 1997. So, lesson number 4, nothing should be only for other people when accommodations are possible. What's interesting about the prevalence of captioning access and cochlear implants is that there is now a blurring of the lines of deaf and hard of hearing, and even who uses what accommodation. We've reached the age where whatever works best for you is the mantra. So, for example, the CHC's Emotional Health and Wellness Center has counselors that can interact directly with clients in American Sign Language. And the counselors can also speak directly with clients who use oral communication and advise on strategies for coping with hearing loss. And so the advocacy mission continues. Anyone who has ever requested captioning for an event and had to explain what it is, or been given a sign language interpreter instead, knows that there is still much to be done. As we recognize the outstanding work of our honorees, it's important to remember that hearing loss, the invisible disability, continues to need ever more light shown on it. Everyone wants to be able to participate at events with appropriate access and with dignity.